The first bomb fell by accident. It split the clear April sky of 1944 with a shriek no one in Schaffhausen had ever heard before. Church bells were ringing for Vespers. Laundry fluttered in small gardens. A train idled near the station, steam drifting lazily upward. Then the earth convulsed. Windows burst outward like startled eyes. The station roof folded in on itself. Smoke rose in a thick, choking column between tidy red rooftops that had never imagined themselves targets. In that instant, America, half a world away, had declared a war it never meant to fight. Anna Meyer was 19, apprenticed to a watchmaker whose shop smelled of oil and polished brass. She had been bent over a tiny balance spring when the blast hurled her backward. Glass exploded inward, peppering the counter with glittering shards. Hundreds of delicate gears scattered across the floor like metallic rain. For a heartbeat there was only silence. Then came the screaming. Anna stumbled outside into a street she barely recognized. Smoke drifted across familiar facades. The railway yard burned in uneven bursts as if the town itself were coughing. A woman clawed at rubble with bare hands. A horse thrashed against broken reins. Somewhere beneath the chaos a bell kept ringing, steady and absurd. They had drilled for invasion for years. Switzerland lived with maps of Europe pressed against its conscience. Every schoolchild knew where Germany lay, where Italy watched, where France had fallen. Bunkers were carved into mountainsides. Bridges were wired for demolition. Men trained with rifles in alpine meadows, but no one expected bombers with white stars on their wings. Across the Atlantic, the news arrived in Washington in the stiff language of cables and military codes. A formation of American bombers returning from a mission over southern Germany had encountered heavy cloud. Navigators recalculated under pressure. Winds were misjudged. A railway complex was identified. Bombs were released. Later, through fragmented radio chatter, the terrible realization emerged. The target had been Swiss. Lieutenant Daniel Harper sat on his bunk at an English airfield when his commanding officer read the preliminary report aloud. Daniel did not look up. He stared at his hands that had traced lines across maps, that had adjusted headings with confidence, that had marked coordinates with a pencil sharpened to a perfect point. He had been lead navigator that day. He replayed it relentlessly. The flak bursts forcing them higher, the overcast that erased landmarks, the pressure of fuel calculations. The moment he gave the final confirmation, he remembered feeling certain enough to send thousands of pounds of explosives toward what he believed was enemy infrastructure. Now the word Switzerland hollowed him out. He had never thought of the country as anything more than a neutral gap between warring giants. Safe, quiet, untouched. The idea that his pencil mark had torn through that quiet made his chest tighten in a way no enemy fire ever had. In Schaffhausen, Anna joined neighbors clawing through debris. Her fingers, trained for fragile watch parts, now lifted bricks slick with dust. She found Herr Keller, her mentor, pinned beneath a collapsed beam. His spectacles were gone, his breathing shallow. When she knelt beside him, he blinked at her through grit and smoke. "They fight everywhere," he whispered, voice thin as wire, "even here." By evening, the town square was crowded with the displaced. Blankets were handed out. Names were called. The Swiss flag still hung from the municipal building untouched, its red bright against grey ash. Neutrality had always felt like armor. Now it felt like paper. Swiss newspapers printed photographs the next morning, shattered windows, twisted rails, children with soot-streaked faces. Headlines did not scream, they accused. Neutral airspace had been violated, civilians had been killed. The government lodged a formal protest to the United States. Language precise, but heavy with indignation. Apologies came swiftly from Washington. Regret, error, compensation. Assurances that such a mistake would not happen again. But in Schaffhausen, regret did not rebuild walls. At the English airfield, Daniel avoided the mess hall chatter. Some men dismissed it as unfortunate but inevitable. Fog of war, they said. Could have been worse. Others grew quiet when he entered the room. No one accused him directly. They didn't need to. That night he walked beyond the barracks, past the perimeter fence, where the English countryside lay still under a pale moon. He tried to convince himself that the war required hard decisions. Germany's factories had to be struck. Rail lines had to be severed. Mistakes were tragic, yes, but the alternative was surrender. Yet the image that kept rising in his mind was not a factory. It was a town square, bells ringing. A week later, rumors rippled through the squadron. Switzerland had increased air patrols along its borders. Neutral fighters would intercept any aircraft straying into their skies. Damaged bombers might be forced to land, and crews interned for the duration of the war, not prisoners, exactly, but not free. The idea unsettled Daniel more than Flack ever had. To be held by a country he had wronged. To look into faces that saw him not as liberator or ally, but as violator. Back in Schaffhausen, Anna stood outside the damaged watch shop, staring at its boarded windows. Inside, clocks had stopped at the moment of impact. Their frozen hands marked a single shared second of rupture. She touched the cracked doorframe gently, as if it might bruise further. Above her, the mountains rose unchanged, indifferent and eternal. Switzerland would not march into war. It would not abandon neutrality. But something fragile had shifted. Far above those same mountains, engines would soon hum again. And when they did, Switzerland would be watching. The sky over England turned the color of wet iron the morning Daniel flew again. No one mentioned Switzerland during briefing, but the silence around the word was thick enough to feel. Maps were unrolled. Targets in southern Germany circled in grease pencil. Weather reports warned of shifting winds over the Alps. Daniel's eyes lingered there over the white spine of mountains that now seemed less like geography and more like a boundary he had already crossed once. He recalculated headings twice. Then a third time, when the engines roared to life, the vibration traveled up through his boots and into his ribs. He climbed into the nose compartment, folding himself into the cramped glass world of dials and charts. Outside, the runway blurred. Then the earth fell away. Cloud cover swallowed them before they even reached the channel. Hours later, over Germany, the sky erupted with black puffs of anti-aircraft bursts. The bomber shuddered. Metal rang like a struck bell. Daniel forced his breathing steady, calling out adjustments as the pilot fought to hold formation. The bomb bay doors opened. The payload dropped clean. On the return leg, number 3 engine began to cough. It was subtle at first, a tremor in the vibration, a flicker on the oil pressure gauge. Then smoke trailed thin and gray behind the wing. The engineer's voice tightened. Fuel calculations shifted instantly from routine to desperate. "We won't make England," the pilot muttered. Daniel bent over his charts. The channel lay too far northwest. France was crawling with danger. To the south rose the only alternative, a jagged horizon of snow and stone, Switzerland. Before anyone could speak it aloud, a silver fighter appeared off their right wing. Sleek, controlled, close enough that Daniel could see the red field and white cross on its fuselage. The fighter rocked its wings once. Another slid into position on the left. Neutrality had teeth. The pilot's jaw clenched. "What's our heading, Harper?" Daniel swallowed. "South. They want us south." Fuel bled away. The damaged engine sputtered louder. Resisting would be pointless, maybe catastrophic. He gave a small nod the pilot didn't need to see. The bomber turned toward the mountains. Below them, the Alps unfolded like a frozen ocean. Valleys cut deep and narrow, villages nestled like careful secrets. The war felt impossibly distant and uncomfortably close all at once. In Schaffhausen, Anna heard the distant drone engines and froze mid-step. The memory of April was still raw in her bones, but when she looked up, the formation passed high overhead, flanked by smaller aircraft. No bombs fell, no smoke trailed downward. The planes disappeared behind the mountains. Word spread quickly that a foreign bomber had been forced down near a valley airstrip. American, people whispered, the same Americans who had shattered the railway yard. Curiosity and anger braided together in town conversation. Switzerland would remain neutral. Switzerland would follow international law. Crews would be interned, treated correctly, held until war's end. That was the rule. Rules felt thin. Daniel barely remembered the landing. The runway appeared suddenly between ridges. Snow dusted its edges. The pilot coaxed the wounded bomber down with shaking hands. Tires screeched. The aircraft rolled to a stop under the watchful gaze of Swiss soldiers already positioned along the tarmac. Rifles were held at the ready, not aggressively but firmly. Professional. Controlled. When Daniel climbed out, the air struck him like a blade, clean, cold. The mountains loomed impossibly tall, as if nature itself was standing guard over neutrality. A Swiss officer approached, boots crunching on frost. He was not much older than Daniel, his uniform immaculate, his expression unreadable. "You are in Swiss territory," the officer said in careful English. "You will surrender your weapons and follow instructions. You will be treated according to international convention." Daniel nodded. His throat felt dry. Understood. As he handed over his sidearm, a strange thought pierced him. This was the first time since training that he was not in control of his own direction. The sky, once freedom, had delivered him into custody. The crew was transported by truck through winding mountain roads. Villages passed by in quiet observation. Curtains twitched. Children pointed. No one waved. At the internment camp, a converted hotel overlooking a lake, they were assigned rooms under guard. It was not a prison in the brutal sense. Beds were clean. Food was adequate, but fences framed the property, and Swiss soldiers patrolled with quiet vigilance. Daniel stood at the window that evening, staring at the lake reflecting pale sunset. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay Schaffhausen. Somewhere beneath those same skies lay the town he had helped scar. He wondered if the people here knew his face. In town, Anna listened as neighbors debated what should be done with the interned Americans. Some argued they were young men caught in machinery beyond their control. Others said neutrality meant consequences. If Switzerland did not defend its airspace, it would invite more violations from any side. Anna said little. She remembered the smoke. She remembered Herr Keller's trembling hand in hers. But she also remembered the planes passing overhead that morning, escorted, not attacking. Days later, a small group from Schaffhausen was allowed to visit the valley near the internment camp to assess damage from an earlier forced landing. Anna volunteered to accompany the Watchmakers Guild representative. She told herself it was practical. She needed spare parts salvaged from damaged shipments. The bus wound through mountain roads until the lake came into view, blue and deceptively peaceful. On the hotel terrace, American airmen stood in small clusters under guard, their uniforms creased, their faces pale against alpine light. Daniel felt eyes on him before he saw her. She stood near the edge of the terrace with a small notebook in hand, hair pulled back against the wind. She did not look angry. She looked searching. For a suspended second, the war narrowed to two young people staring across a few meters of stone. Neither spoke, but both understood that neutrality had become personal. Daniel had imagined anger would look loud. He expected shouting, accusations, a finger pointed at his chest. Instead, the young woman on the terrace simply watched him. The lake behind her was impossibly calm, its surface holding the mountains in a perfect reflection. Daniel felt as if he were standing between two worlds, one of sky and engine, and burning cities, the other of still water and deliberate silence. The Swiss guard beside him shifted slightly, reminding him of the invisible line he could not cross. The woman stepped forward first. "You are American," she said. Her English was careful, touched with the softness of French and German meeting somewhere in between. "Yes." Daniel forced himself not to look away. "Lieutenant Daniel Harper." She nodded once. Anna Meyer. The name struck him harder than he expected. It was a name that belonged to a real place, a real street, a real shop. Not a map. "You are from here?" he asked. "Schaffhausen." The word tightened the air between them. Daniel felt heat creep into his face despite the cold wind. "I'm sorry." It was inadequate. He knew it the moment it left his mouth. Anna studied him not with cruelty but with unsettling steadiness. "Were you there?" she asked. "Yes." The admission felt like stepping off a ledge. "I was the navigator." She inhaled slowly, as if bracing against something invisible. The guard watched but did not interrupt. The Swiss were meticulous about protocol. Conversation was not forbidden. "Our station was destroyed," she said. "My mentor was injured. He builds watches, very small pieces, very careful work." She paused. "Your bombs were not careful." Daniel swallowed. "We thought it was a rail yard in Germany." "The clouds. The winds were wrong. That isn't an excuse. It's just the truth." She looked past him for a moment, toward the distant peaks. "We built our country on staying out of this war," she said quietly. "We train, we prepare, but we do not choose sides. Still, the war finds us." Her words weren't an accusation. They were a fact. Daniel had no defense against facts. "I never thought about Switzerland," he admitted. "Not really. It was just a blank space on the map between targets." Anna's eyes flickered at that. Not with rage, something deeper. "We are not blank." The sentence landed with the weight of the mountains behind her. For a long moment neither spoke. Around them, other internees shuffled under supervision. A Swiss officer scribbled notes near the terrace entrance. The lake lapped gently against its shore, indifferent to politics. "You will stay here?" Anna asked. "Until the war ends," Daniel replied. "That's what they told us." She considered this. "Then you will see Switzerland." There was something almost challenging in the way she said it. In the days that followed, Daniel began to understand what she meant. Internment was not a dungeon. The Americans were confined to the grounds and nearby paths under escort. They were given limited work maintenance, snow clearing, language lessons. Swiss authorities were determined to demonstrate both neutrality and order. No favoritism, no cruelty. The first time Daniel walked along the lake under guard, he was struck by the soundlessness. No distant artillery, no droning formations overhead. Just wind threading through pine trees and the crunch of boots on gravel. Peace felt unnatural. Anna returned twice that week, with guild representatives cataloging machinery stored in the hotel's old ballroom. Each time she and Daniel exchanged cautious words. The conversations grew less brittle, more searching. "Why do you fly?" she asked one afternoon as they stood near stacked crates. He hesitated. No one had asked him that without judgment before. At first, it felt like duty. After Pearl Harbor, everything changed. It felt like the world demanded something of us. He paused. "Then it became about the men in my crew." "You don't think about politics at 20,000 feet. You think about getting everyone home." She nodded slowly. "We think about keeping everyone home." The difference hung between them. News filtered into the camp in fragments. Allied advances, German retreats, rumors of offensives through France. Each update tightened something in Daniel's chest. His friends were still flying, still facing fire, and he was here, safe, confined, suspended between combat and consequence. One evening, snow began to fall in thick, silent sheets. The mountains disappeared behind a white veil. Daniel stood by the window watching flakes settle over the lake, erasing sharp edges. A knock came at the door. A Swiss guard stood there. "You have a visitor. 5 minutes." Daniel's pulse quickened as he stepped into the corridor. Anna waited near the stairwell, scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. "I should not be here long," she said. "But I wanted to tell you something." He braced himself. "My mentor, Herr Keller, he is recovering. Slowly, he says. He says that precision can fail even the best hands. What matters is what those hands do next. Daniel felt something inside him shift. Not absolution, not forgiveness, but possibility. "I don't know what I can do," he admitted. "You can remember," she said, "when you go back to your sky." He looked at her sharply. "If I go back?" "You will," she said with quiet certainty. "The war will end, and you will leave. The question is what you carry with you." Footsteps echoed down the corridor. The guard cleared his throat. Anna stepped back. "Switzerland is not blank," she said again, softer this time. Then she was gone, leaving Daniel alone with the sound of snow against the glass. The uncomfortable, undeniable truth that America's accidental war had given him. Something he had never expected a face to answer to. Spring arrived in the Alps without asking permission. Snow retreated up the slopes in uneven streaks, revealing dark grass and stubborn wildflowers pushing through thawed earth. The lake shifted from steel gray to a clear, piercing blue. From the terrace of the internment hotel, Daniel could see fishermen returning at dawn, their small boats cutting quiet paths across water that seemed untouched by the rest of Europe's chaos. The stillness began to weigh on him. Letters from England reached the camp weeks late, their edges worn from travel and censorship. One from his co-pilot mentioned heavy losses over the Ruhr. Another spoke of a new offensive building in France. Names were crossed out in ink. "Didn't make it back," the note read in one corner, almost as an afterthought. Daniel folded the paper carefully and stared at the mountains. He was alive, safe, fed, and he felt guilty for it. Among the internees, tension simmered beneath polite routines. Some men tried to escape, slipping past fences at night, hoping to reach Allied lines through France. A few were caught within hours. Others vanished longer, only to be quietly returned by Swiss patrols. Neutrality was patient, but it was firm. One afternoon, a commotion stirred near the main gate. A Swiss newspaper had published an editorial questioning whether the Americans should be granted so much freedom after repeated airspace violations. The article referenced the bombing of Schaffhausen again, its language sharper than before. Daniel saw Anna that evening on the lakeside path, escorted as always by a guard who kept a respectful distance. "They are angry again," she said without preamble. "Because of us. Because of what happened. And because it could happen again." She folded her arms against the wind. "Some people think Switzerland is too forgiving." Daniel met her eyes. "Are you one of them?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gestured toward the mountains. "We prepare for invasion from any direction. Germany, Italy, even the Allies if necessary. Our neutrality is defended, not passive." She looked back at him. "When bombs fall here, it feels like that defense failed." He nodded slowly. It wasn't deliberate. "I know," she exhaled, "but intention does not repair roofs." They walked a few steps along the path, gravel crunching underfoot. "Why do your planes cross our borders so often?" she asked quietly. Daniel considered the question carefully. Sometimes it's weather, sometimes damaged aircraft, sometimes pilots chasing survival. In the sky, borders aren't visible, only coordinates. She stopped walking. "That is exactly the problem." The words settled between them like a stone dropped into water. That night, Daniel lay awake long after lights out. He thought about invisible lines on maps, about how easy it had been to see Switzerland an empty space. The war had trained him to think in targets and trajectories, not in towns and watchmakers. He began volunteering for maintenance tasks around the camp, repairing radios, fixing broken hinges, recalibrating clocks in the lobby. It was small work, but it steadied him. Precision mattered here. One morning, a Swiss officer approached him while he was adjusting a wall clock. "You a navigator," the officer said, not unkindly. "Yes, you understand maps, distances, margins of error." Daniel straightened. "I do." The officer studied him. "Our government is arranging discussions with Allied representatives. We want clearer flight corridors, better coordination, fewer mistakes. A flicker of something like hope passed through Daniel. That's good. The officer's gaze sharpened. It will require information from pilots who have flown those routes. Would you be willing to provide your experience? The request startled him. To help Switzerland, to help avoid another Schaffhausen. Daniel didn't hesitate. Yes, in the weeks that followed, he found himself seated at a long wooden table inside a municipal building overlooking the lake. Swiss military officials unfolded detailed maps of the region. They asked about wind drift at altitude, about common navigation errors in heavy cloud, about how bombers identified rail yards from 20,000 feet. Daniel answered with painful honesty. He marked where confusion could arise, where similar terrain might deceive tired eyes, where radio interference often disrupted formation signals. He felt exposed, stripped off, the protective myth that American air power was flawless. But he also felt, for the first time since April, useful. Anna watched one of these sessions from the back of the room, invited as part of a civic delegation. When Daniel glanced up and saw her, he felt steadier. Afterward, they stood outside beneath budding trees. "You are helping," she said. "I should have known better the first time." She shook her head slightly. "War is noise. It drowns out careful thought." Her eyes softened. "But you are listening now." A distant rumble rolled faintly through the valley. Both of them looked up instinctively. High above, barely visible against pale sky, a formation of aircraft moved eastward, tiny silver glints heading toward Germany. Daniel felt the old pull in his chest, the instinct to calculate headings, to measure distance, to be part of the motion rather than watching from below. Anna saw it in his expression. "You miss it," she said. "I miss my crew," he corrected gently. Silence settled again, but it was no longer brittle. It carried weight and understanding. America's accidental war against Switzerland had begun with a mistake in the clouds. Now, in quiet rooms with maps spread wide, the two nations were trying to redraw those clouds into something clearer. Yet both Daniel and Anna knew that as long as the larger war raged beyond the mountains, neutrality would remain fragile, an island surrounded by storm. And storms, as they had learned, did not always respect borders. By the summer of 1944, the valley no longer felt like a pause in time. It felt like a waiting room with no clock. News traveled faster now. Allied forces had landed in France. Paris was whispered like a prayer in the corridors of the internment hotel. Guards pretended indifference, but even they lingered longer over newspapers. The war was shifting inch by inch toward an ending no one could quite see. Daniel stood at the lakeshore one humid evening, skimming a stone across the surface. It skipped twice before sinking. He imagined the men from his squadron flying over France, threading through flak and smoke. He should have been with them. That thought never left him. Instead, he spent his days in meeting rooms with Swiss officers, refining flight corridors and marking danger zones along the northern border. His notes were sent through diplomatic channels. Messages passed quietly between Bern and Washington. There were no headlines about it, no ceremonies, just careful ink lines intended to prevent another shattered railway station. Anna joined him often after those sessions. They had fallen into a rhythm, walking the same path along the lake, speak in low voices as if the mountains themselves were listening. "My brother thinks you should all be sent home immediately," she told him one evening. "He says keeping you here only creates resentment." "And what do you think?" Daniel asked. She watched a pair of swans glide near the reeds. "I think neutrality means we cannot choose which prisoners to keep and which to release. Even if some of you did not mean harm." She hesitated. "But I also think holding you here reminds America that we are not invisible." He nodded. "We don't see enough of what's beneath us." The words lingered. A week later, the valley woke to the thunder of engines again. This time, the sound was wrong. Daniel recognized it instantly, the uneven rhythm of an aircraft in distress. He ran to the terrace with several other internees. High above the eastern ridge, A bomber limped westward, one engine trailing dark smoke. Swiss fighters were already climbing to meet it. The bomber dipped lower, struggling. For a moment it looked as though it might clear the ridge and disappear. Then it lost altitude abruptly, vanishing behind the trees beyond the lake. A distant thud followed, dull and final. Silence crashed down afterward. Within minutes, Swiss trucks were racing along the narrow mountain road. Daniel gripped the terrace railing so tightly his knuckles whitened. "Let us help," he muttered to the nearest guard. "Please, we know those aircraft." The guard hesitated, then shook his head. Orders. Hours passed before news filtered back. The bomber had attempted an emergency landing in a meadow near a small village. It had broken apart on impact. Survivors were being transported to the nearest medical post. Several crew members had not made it. Daniel felt something tear open inside him. That evening, Anna found him alone near the water. "It was American," she said softly. He nodded without looking at her. "I knew the sound. They tried to reach your lines. They always try." His voice cracked despite himself. "No one wants to be the crew that doesn't make it home." Anna stepped closer. "The survivors will be interned here."
"Yes."
She studied him carefully. "You are thinking about escaping again?" He turned sharply. "If I were with them, if I'd made it back to England, you might be the one in that meadow," she finished gently. The truth silenced him. 2 days later, the surviving crew arrived at the hotel, bandaged and hollow-eyed. Daniel recognized one of them, Corporal Eddie Ruiz, a mechanic from a neighboring squadron. They embraced awkwardly under the watch of guards. "They say we hit Swiss airspace by accident," Eddie murmured. "Storm pushed us south." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The pattern felt cruelly familiar. That night, unable to sleep, he slipped from his room and walked the corridor until he reached the small chapel on the ground floor. It was rarely used. A single candle flickered near the altar. He knelt, not out of habit but out of exhaustion. "I never meant for any of this," he whispered into the dim space. Footsteps approached softly behind him. He did not need to turn to know it was Anna. "You think intention decides everything," she said quietly. "What else is there? Responsibility." The words struck him harder than accusation ever could. She moved beside him, not kneeling, simply standing in the candlelight. "You cannot undo April. You cannot undo the crash this week. But you can decide what kind of man leaves this valley when the war ends." He looked up at her, eyes rimmed red. "And if I don't leave?" "You will," she said, though uncertainty flickered in her gaze for the first time. The war cannot last forever. Outside, the mountains held their vigil. Switzerland had not chosen to fight America. America had not chosen to fight Switzerland. Yet in the narrow space between mistakes and consequences, lives had been altered permanently. The valley no longer felt like a waiting room. It felt like a reckoning. Autumn crept into the valley with a sharper edge than anyone expected. The trees along the lake turned copper and gold, their reflections trembling in colder water. The air carried a brittle clarity that made every sound, boots on gravel, doors closing, distant church bells feel amplified. Inside the internment hotel, rumors began to circulate with new urgency. Allied forces were pushing deeper into Germany. Cities that had once seemed unreachable were now falling one by one. The end was no longer an abstract hope. It was approaching, uneven and unstoppable. With that approach came tension. Some of the younger internees grew restless, convinced the war would end before winter. A few whispered about slipping across the border again, about rejoining their units in time for the final push. Swiss guards doubled patrols, not out of hostility but out of caution. Neutrality had to hold until the very last day. Daniel felt the pressure building inside himself as well. Every report of Allied advance stirred something raw. He imagined his old crew flying over collapsing German lines, engines roaring toward a victory he would not share. The thought tasted bitter. One afternoon, a Swiss officer summoned him back to the municipal building. The long wooden table was covered once more in maps, but this time they were marked differently: corridor, highlighted in bold pencil, revised boundaries traced carefully along mountain ridges. Our discussions with the Americans have resulted in new agreements, the officer explained: clearer routes, designated emergency corridors, better communication protocols. Daniel ran his fingers lightly over the paper. The lines he had helped draw were now official. This will reduce violations, the officer continued. We believe significantly. Daniel nodded slowly. I'm glad. The officer regarded him thoughtfully. You understand that some of my countrymen still see you as the man who helped bomb Schaffhausen. I understand, and yet you have helped prevent another. Daniel held the officer's gaze. That matters to me. When he stepped outside, Anna was waiting beneath a tree, shedding its last leaves. They approved the new corridors, he told her. She smiled, but it was a restrained, careful smile. Then something good came from this. Something small. Small things are how Switzerland survives, she replied. They began walking toward the lake shore, their pace slower now, heavier with the knowledge that time was narrowing. Do you think of going home every day? She asked. Yes. He didn't hesitate. And every day I am not sure where home is anymore. She looked at him sharply. I mean, he searched for the right words. England was temporary. The sky was constant. But this valley, this place, it changed me. Anna's voice softened. War changes everyone, even those who try to stand outside it. As if summoned by the word, the distant hum of engines rolled faintly across the mountains. They both stopped. A formation of bombers moved high above the northern ridge, silver shapes against pale blue. They were heading east toward Germany. Daniel felt the familiar pull in his chest, but it was different now. Less urgent, more reflective. I used to think altitude made everything clearer, he said quietly, but from up there, you don't see faces, just targets. And from down here, Anna asked, from down here you see what's at stake. The engines faded into the distance. Winter arrived early that year. Snow fell thick and relentless, isolating the valley in white silence. The war beyond the mountains grew louder, even as the valley grew quieter. Reports spoke of cities crumbling, of armies retreating, of surrender rumors. Then, in late January, an official announcement reached the camp. Germany's position was collapsing. The end was near. The news did not bring celebration. It brought stillness. Daniel stood alone on the terrace that night, snow crunching underfoot. He imagined the moment the war would finally stop, the sudden absence of engine roar, of coded briefings, of letters edged in loss. Footsteps approached behind him. It will be over soon, Anna said. Yes, you will leave. He nodded. The simplicity of it hurt more than he expected. She stepped beside him, both of them staring at the frozen lake. When you return to America, she said slowly, will you remember Schaffhausen? I will never forget it. Will you remember that neutrality is not weakness? I will. She turned to face him fully. And will you remember that even mistakes carry responsibility? He met her gaze without flinching. Every day. For a moment, the world felt suspended, snow falling softly around them. Mountains standing as silent witnesses. America's war against Switzerland had never been declared. It had never been intentional, but it had forced two nations and two young people to confront the fragile space between power and consequence. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the last chapters of the war were being written in smoke and fire. Here, in the quiet valley, the final chapter would be written in goodbye. The end came not with thunder, but with a radio announcement. It was early May 1945 when the Swiss commandant gathered the internees in the hotel's dining hall. The room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. Outside, the lake shimmered under a fragile spring sun, as if nothing extraordinary were happening. Germany had surrendered. The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. No one cheered at first. The American airmen simply stood there, absorbing the reality that the sky, which had defined their youth, was suddenly quiet. Some removed their caps. One man let out a slow breath that sounded almost like grief. Daniel felt the floor steady beneath him in a way it hadn't for months. The war that had carried him across oceans into cloud and error and consequence was over. He looked instinctively toward the windows, toward the mountains that had held him in their shadow. For a year they had been both barrier and refuge. Now they felt like a threshold. Repatriation would begin within weeks, the commandant explained. Arrangements were already underway with Allied authorities. The internees would be transported to France, then onward to their respective commands. Home, the word stirred complicated currents inside Daniel. America felt distant now, not geographically but emotionally. The valley had given him something he hadn't expected, a reckoning and a mirror. He found Anna that afternoon by the lake shore. She was kneeling near the reeds, adjusting a small wooden box that floated tethered to a poster device for measuring water levels. Even now, Switzerland measured everything carefully. "It's finished," he said. She nodded without looking up. Yes. There was no smile this time. He stepped closer. "I'll be leaving soon, I know." The wind rippled the water between them. In the distance, church bells rang, not in alarm, not in mourning, just marking the hour. "Does it feel different?" he asked her quietly. "Now that it's over?" She stood slowly, brushing dampness from her hands. "The war did not cross our borders in armies. It crossed in moments, in bombs, in planes landing in our fields, in young men who did not know our towns had names." She met his eyes. Those moments do not disappear when a surrender is signed. Daniel felt the weight of that truth settle into him. "I never asked you something," she continued. "If that day in April had been clearer, if you had known exactly where you were, would you have turned away?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Even if it meant missing your target?" "Yes." She studied him carefully, as if measuring the precision of his answer the way her mentor once measured the balance of a watch. "Then perhaps something changed," she said softly. They walked along the shore in silence for a while. The valley was alive with cautious relief. Farmers were repairing fences neglected during years of tension. Children chased each other near the water, their laughter less restrained now. "I used to think neutrality meant standing still," Daniel admitted, "but it takes strength to hold your ground when everyone else is moving." Anna gave a faint smile. "We move, just not always in the same direction as others." As the days passed, the camp grew restless. In a different way, trunks were packed, uniforms brushed and mended, addresses exchanged. Some of the American airmen grew exuberant, already imagining parades and celebration. Others were quieter, carrying the invisible weight of what they had survived and what they had not. Daniel found himself lingering in small routines, repairing a clock in the lobby one last time, standing on the terrace at dusk, memorizing the exact line where mountain met sky. On his final evening in the valley, Anna asked him to meet her at the old railway station in Schaffhausen. It had been rebuilt partially. Fresh timber stood beside older stones scarred by impact. The platform was quieter than he imagined it had once been. They stood together near the edge where the tracks disappeared westward. "This is where it happened," she said simply. He looked at the repaired facade, the careful brickwork, the new glass reflecting fading light. "I'm sorry," he said again, not as a reflex, not as a defense, just as truth. Anna nodded. "I know." A train whistle echoed faintly in the distance. "When you tell people about this war," she said, "what will you say about Switzerland?" He considered the question carefully. That neutrality isn't emptiness, that even mistakes have faces, that lines on maps are not blank spaces. She seemed satisfied with that. The train's headlamp appeared around the bend, cutting through dusk. "This is not a love story," she said gently, almost smiling. "It is a lesson." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "Some lessons stay with you." The train slowed, metal wheels shrieking softly against rails that had once been shattered. Swiss officials stood nearby, overseeing the departure of the last American internees. He picked up his bag. Anna extended her hand. For a moment he simply looked at it, Steady, deliberate, unafraid. Then he took it. "Goodbye, Lieutenant," she said. "Goodbye, Anna." He stepped onto the train, turning once more as it began to move. She remained on the platform, framed by rebuilt stone and mountain silhouette. As the valley slipped behind him, Daniel understood something with clarity he had never possessed at 20,000 feet. America had never truly been at war with Switzerland, but for one town, for one navigator, and for one young woman standing on a repaired platform, the war had crossed, a border it could never fully erase. The first thing Daniel noticed when he reached France was the noise, engines revving in celebration, voices shouting in half a dozen accents, church bells clanging without fear. The world beyond the Alps was erupting in relief, in release, in something dangerously close to forgetting. He stood on a crowded platform in Lyon with other former internees, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, watching soldiers embrace strangers. Flags waved from balconies. Someone pressed a bottle into his hand and laughed when he didn't immediately drink. "You're free now," the man shouted. Free. Daniel looked up at the open sky. For the first time in more than a year, there were no guards at his side, no fences, no mountains hemming him in, and yet freedom felt heavier than captivity. He was processed, quickly debriefed about his internment, asked about Swiss procedures, flight corridors, conditions. An officer skimmed through Daniel's notes on revised navigation routes and nodded approvingly. "Good work," the officer said. "Helped avoid further incidents. Daniel signed the paperwork with steady hands, but inside he was somewhere else entirely, standing beside a lake, hearing church bells over a town that had never asked to be part of his war. Weeks later, he returned to America. There were no parades for navigators who had spent the last year behind neutral fences. His family met him at the station in Ohio, his mother crying openly, his father gripping his shoulder with a pride that said more than words ever could. "You made it home," his father said. Daniel nodded. He had. But home felt different now. At night, he dreamed not of flak bursts or clouded targets, but of mountains, of a repaired railway station, of a young woman measuring water levels with deliberate care. He took a position teaching navigation at a small airfield, training new pilots in peacetime precision. On the first day of class, he drew a map on the chalkboard Europe, sketched in broad strokes. Borders are not suggestions, he told the young men seated before him. They are lives, towns, people who expect to wake up without war falling on their roofs. The cadets shifted, surprised by the intensity in his voice. He spoke of wind drift and radio interference, of how cloud cover can deceive even the most confident navigator. And then he spoke of responsibility. "Intent doesn't erase consequence," he said quietly. "If you're ever unsure, if the sky looks wrong, double check. Then check again." He never mentioned Schaffhausen by name in those lessons, but it was always there. One afternoon, in late autumn, a letter arrived addressed in careful handwriting he recognized instantly. He opened it slowly. Anna wrote about the town's continued rebuilding, about Herr Keller returning to his workbench, hands steady again, about how the railway station now ran trains on time, as if determined to prove something to the world. She wrote of the valley of snow returning to the peaks, of fishermen on the lake at dawn. And at the end, she wrote, "Switzerland remains neutral, but neutrality does not mean forgetting. I hope you have not forgotten either." Daniel folded the letter with care and walked outside into the fading light. The Ohio sky was wide and open, no mountains at its edge. Yet he felt their presence as clearly as if they stood before him. He had gone to war believing precision was mathematical. Coordinates, angles, altitude. He had come home understanding it was human. America had never officially declared war on Switzerland. There had been no speeches, no battle plans, no enemy lines drawn in red ink. Only a mistake in heavy cloud. Only a town that refused to be blank space. only a valley that held him long enough to teach him what power feels like when it lands where it shouldn't. Years later, when people asked him about the war, he told them about missions and fear and the roar of engines at dawn. But sometimes, if they listened closely, he told them about a quiet country that defended its neutrality with discipline and dignity. He told them about a railway station rebuilt stone by stone. He told them about a lesson learned too late for some, but not too late for him. And when he finished, he would pause not for drama, but for respect. Because wars are not only fought between declared enemies. Sometimes they begin with a single error in the clouds. If this story moved you, if you believe history is not just about battles, but about the human lines between them, subscribe to my channel, Red Maps World War II.